again, it's another panel following the progression of the overall conference from science to policy. And so we're going to start with Mike Ross, who was a guest lecturer in my class last year when I taught natural resources law, and stopped right at the introduction of the Endangered Species Act. As Jonathan Adler pointed out, the Endangered Species Act is a very short law. It's only a handful of sections, unlike the Clean Air Act, which is not a short law. And as I tell my students, one of them's in the class right in the back there, will remember very well, that the Endangered Species Act is you scratch a little bit beneath the surface and you're talking about a bunch of scientific stuff that's not really legal. And you have to be able to be conversant with the scientific stuff. Whereas the Clean Air Act, by comparison, is an endless morass of legality and you will never escape it if you enter. So we're starting with Mike Ross. Mike Ross is a plant, community, and landscape ecologist in the Institute of Environment and the Department of Earth and Environment at Florida International University. His academic training was in silviculture and forest ecology with a short detour to complete a master's degree in environmental law at Vermont Law School. His research experiences have familiarized him with forests throughout North America, expanding eventually into the Caribbean Basin. Recently, he and his students have focused on restoration of the mixture of forested and herbaceous coastal wetlands of the greater Everglades ecosystem, with an emphasis on how these systems will respond to continuing sea level rise and altered disturbance regimes. After Mike Ross talks to us, we're going to hear from Steve Davis, who's the Chief Science Officer of the Everglades Foundation. A native of Ohio, he earned his PhD from Florida International University in 1999 with research in Florida Bay and coastal Everglades. He joined the Everglades Foundation in 2009 as a member of the science department, and he became a key voice in support of the organization's mission to restore America's Everglades. He draws upon his 25 years of Everglades science and teaching experience, including 10 years as professor of wetlands ecology at Texas A&M University, to lead science communications and outreach efforts focused on Everglades restoration, ecosystem health, and impacts of sea level rise. And so we're going to hear from those two scientists, Mike on the topic of habitat conservation, Steve on the topic of ecology, protection, and restoration. And then we're going to move over to the law and policy side, where we're going to hear Dominic Parker, fellow, I guess you teach at the University of Wisconsin, you didn't graduate from there like I did. Fellow Madisonite. Dominic Parker is a professor of applied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he serves editorial roles for 3 leading academic journals in environmental and resource economics. Parker is also a visiting fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, a senior fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center, and a regular faculty lecturer in the Ronald Coast Institute and in the Eleanor Ostrom Workshop. His research appears in economic science and law journals and includes studies of property rights and environmental markets, resource blooms and busts, land use, fishery and wildlife regulations, water trading, and renewable energy. It has been covered in over 100 media outlets, including BBC News, Wall Street Journal, AP, The Atlantic, and The Economist. Parker holds a PhD in economics from UC Santa Barbara, where he was a National Science Foundation Fellow in economics and environmental science. And then we will hear from Nancy McLaughlin, who is the Robert Swenson Professor of Law at the University of Utah, S.J. Quinney College of Law in Salt Lake City. She's a leading national expert on conservation easements and the tax incentives offered for their donation, and has published more than 30 articles as well as book chapters and reports on conservation easement related issues. She served as a reporter for the Uniform Law Commission's Uniform Conservation Easement Act Study Committee and an observer regarding conservation easements law for the Uniform Easement Relocation Act. And so before I turn it over to Mike, I just want to give a little bit more background on sort of the concept for this particular panel. One thing in an original iteration, maybe we can have this next year, I had hoped to have a special presentation about the Florida Wildlife Corridor. The Florida Wildlife Corridor, as the name suggests, is a corridor of connected habitat more or less that stretches basically the entire state of Florida. And it's based on the insights of habitat ecology that the real problem, the real dangers of biodiversity loss result from habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. And so connected habitat is very important to biodiversity protection. And of course, connected habitat, when you're talking about connected habitat, if preserving a single species usually requires protection strategies on both public and private land, protecting whole ecosystems and biodiversity, which habitat in general obviously is a regional effort. And something like the Florida Wildlife Corridor has to depend on extensive use of conservation easements so that private land can be managed as part of the entire statewide strategy. And I'll note, and hopefully the state's resiliency officer can be here this time, but hopefully we can have it next year, that the government of Florida has put a lot of resources behind this effort, not just it hasn't just been the state as a private matter, but the government itself that keeps adding chunks of 20,000 more acres and 40,000 more acres here and there in private land essentially that is being roped into conservation easements. And so the question that we have here is, first of all, I want to ask Mike to go into the habitat conservation part of it. That's Mike right there. For Steve to go into the ecology part of it, the restoration of the Everglades, these two big ecosystem level kinds of strategies. And then for Dominic Parker to talk about some of the economics of these arrangements that depend on private land uses, and then for Nancy to round up and talk about the law and policy that's involved, and oftentimes the disconnect between state laws and the federal law framework for habitat conservation. So, Mike, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like I'm here to present sort of local color about three very different species that live in three very different ecosystems here. The first is the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, which is restricted to marl prairies on the eastern and western sides of the Everglades. Second is the key deer that is associated with pine rocklands in the lower Florida Keys. And the last one is the Key Largo wood rat, which is dependent on tropical hardwood forests on what until the 1980s was private land in North Key Largo. So the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, they're completely restricted to these seasonally flooded, very rich in plant species grasslands on the eastern and western peripheries of the Everglades. They nest in low to the ground, within a foot or so of the ground, so they're vulnerable to flooding, particularly during their nesting season, which is in the spring. And while fire is necessary to maintain marl prairie over long term, the habitat is made unavailable to sparrows for a year or two after an individual fire. And finally, the deeper water conditions that we expect in most of the Everglades from Everglades restoration are likely to convert these open prairie grasslands that the sparrow occupies, to convert them to sawgrass marsh that would be unfavorable to for the bird, and that's a challenge for restoration planners. Okay, the key deer is that I spent a lot of time looking at down in the lower Keys, can swim from one island to another, but they only maintain viable populations on relatively large islands, relatively high islands that have open pine forests, closed tropical hardwood hammocks, and freshwater resources. So they have to be large enough and high enough to have a freshwater lens. Right now there used to be many islands with pine rocklands in the lower Keys. Now there's only really 2 with substantial pine forests, and that means the deer are very concentrated and they're vulnerable to diseases and pathogens that run through very dense populations of animals. But the biggest threat that they face is sea level rise, which eventually you lose the freshwater lens, you lose freshwater resources, pine forest goes away because pine forests are dependent on freshwater as well.
Like, what's a freshwater lens?
A freshwater lens, you're in a limestone rock that's a little bit above sea level, and the freshwater floats like this on top of salt water that's under it suffuses the whole rock. Okay, then the last one is the Key Largo wood rat. There are three, I don't show them all there, but there's several. There's a cottonmouth and also Shouse's swallow butterfly that are also listed species that live in Key Largo and are dependent on tropical hardwood hammock, which is a closed, dry tropical forest. The wood rat builds stick nests around existing biological or structure, down trees, rock mounds, and so on. And when they are not able to build stick nests themselves, volunteers and managers will make artificial nests for them. And so this population is really getting a lot of help in surviving. They are affected by exotic predators, one being cats and the other being Burmese pythons, which have just gotten down to the Keys, and they live off of things like wood rats. Okay, this is a picture of North Key Largo. Was entirely in private ownership in the 1970s. And, you know, there was a developer's dream to have condos and resorts all the way down through what's now Biscayne National Park into the Keys, and they had their eye on North Key Largo. Groundbreaking of the Port Bougainville development, which is pictured here in 1982, this was intended to be a imitation Mediterranean village with hundreds of boat slips. This alarmed the staff at the Miami Herald and Carl Hyacin, who worked there, and also the whole environmental community and really a lot of the locals in the Keys, that the spectacular natural ecosystems that they have and the sort of laid-back Keys ambiance that they have was going to disappear with development in North Key Largo. So in 1982, Monroe County organized a committee of landowners, environmentalists, and government officials to hammer out a compromise habitat conservation plan that allowed for development while retaining the natural environment and these rare species. The plan they came up with featured 5 nodes of development, one of them being toward Bougainville, that would be separated from the natural areas in between. The number of living units in the development nodes were limited by the existing road capacity to something like 3,500 over the whole thing. But owners in the parcels in between, in conserved areas there, would receive transferable development rights that could be used to increase density in the nodes or anywhere in Monroe County. The Habitat Conservation Plan was to be implemented by the county through its zoning regulations. This agreement never got much public support in the Keys, and it was never adopted by the county, but the whole publicity about what was going on put a lot of attention on North Key Largo, and the state of Florida acquired it through the Conservation and Recreational Land Program. Okay, next slide is. Okay, so this is North Key Largo today. It's really an incredible landscape. Includes the largest stretch of tropical hardwood forest in the continental U.S. It's co-managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service from one side of the road in the Crocodile Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, and the state parks in Dagny-Johnson State Botanical Reserve. Let's see. The wood rat populations, to some extent, they're sort of moderating. They're on a, I would say, somewhat of a life support system. The other 2 species of hardwood hammock species are doing very well. The crocodiles, which is an endangered species in the wetlands on the Fish and Wildlife side, are doing just fine, as you can see by this crocodile on an abandoned dock from the old Port Bougainville. Finally, just to conclude, the first priority for species conservation is preserving habitat. This was emphasized to me when I talked to the manager in Key Largo before I came here. But next comes the difficult job of understanding the full dimensions of the dynamic species-habitat relationship, which is different in all 3 of these cases, and then actually managing the species to maintain that relationship.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity to stand for a little bit. Will this just jump right into the next slideshow? Okay, great. So this is a little bit of a transition from Mike's presentation. I'm going to touch on the Cape Sable sparrow, but as Mario mentioned, this will sort of continue into a large ecosystem restoration program that is Everglades restoration. And I think it's important to put sort of endangered species into the context of this restoration program, because we have 78 threatened or endangered species of plants and animals within the greater Everglades footprint. Many of these species have been affected by changes to the quality, quantity, timing, and distribution of water across this massive ecosystem. And this picture here is of an area near the northeastern corner of Everglades National Park, which is at the bottom of this ecosystem. It's about 1.5 million acres south of Tamiami Trail. So if you just keep going west out of FIU, you actually drive across the northern boundary of the park, and you'll see some of the restoration projects that are underway there right now. And this area, being the northeast corner, is kind of a pivotal point for restoration, because that's where we're trying to not only send more water, but change the distribution of water from west to east, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Fundamentally, this ecosystem recharges the Biscayne Aquifer. That's our water supply here in Miami-Dade County, throughout the Florida Keys, which is umbilically connected to the Biscayne Aquifer along the Florida Keys Aqueduct. Broward County, as well as southern Palm Beach County. So you're talking close to 5 million people that derive their water supply from this aquifer. In fact, our county's largest well field is not too far west of here, kind of west-northwest, the northwest well field. In fact, it represents about 60+% of Miami-Dade County's water supply. To understand the changes that restoration seeks to fix, we have to go back in time. And of course, we didn't have a satellite in the late 1800s, but that image on the left is roughly what this ecosystem looked like in that very narrow white strip along the lower East Coast. That's the Atlantic Coastal Ridge. That's our high ground here in South Florida, upwards of 20 feet in elevation. So that being high ground, it did not flood seasonally with our wet season rains. In fact, the Everglades was connected laterally to Biscayne Bay through a number of cuts in that ridge, as well as through the very transmissive geology that we have here in South Florida. So this was a large connected ecosystem. And what we have now on the right, obviously, is a much more developed lower East Coast, where we've carved away much of the Everglades. In fact, where we are here, where Miami International Airport is, that was all seasonally flooded as part of the Everglades ecosystem. And it's important to note that restoration is not about taking that land back. It's about trying to work with what remains. And what remains is about 3 million acres or so of wetlands in the water conservation areas north of Everglades National Park, and as well as the roughly 750,000 acres in Big Cypress National Preserve further to the west. And the other thing I want to point out here, where once we had a very connected Lake Okeechobee to this ecosystem, we now have a situation where there's an agricultural area right smack south of the lake, and so water can't obviously flow freely any longer. Changes in land use, obviously, over the past century has led to the pollution of Lake Okeechobee, and so the releases from the lake to the east and west coast are an artifact of replumbing South Florida, and that pollution and the discharges from the lake are so high and unnatural that it's essentially an extension of the lake into coastal estuaries. The Caloosahatchee River that feeds the west coast freshens up that estuary all the way out to Sanibel Island. In some extreme years, those discharges can be so high, you can get freshwater toxic cyanobacteria blooms in that estuary. We see the same thing on the east coast to the St. Lucie River. The water that the Everglades gets, if it's not rainfall directly, then it's pollution running off of those sugar fields south of the lake. And so dealing with that water quality issue has been a major component of Everglades restoration. These are all images I've taken of restoration. What does restoration look like? It's big water infrastructure projects. Large storage reservoirs, 10,000 acres in footprint, with deep water stacked on top of that. We have very large storage tanks planned as part of Everglades restoration. That's effectively how you reconnect these water bodies, Lake Okeechobee back to the south, by storing water instead of dumping it. We also clean that water through engineered wetlands. I'll show you that in a minute, but we also have large pumps that help us to put water under bridges along Tamiami Trail. That giant chainsaw that you see on the image, that is it's the largest trencher in the world, and we have it here in South Florida. And it's basically trenching 55 feet down. We backfill that with concrete, bentonite clay, and we create an impermeable barrier so that we can put water in the Everglades and not have it leak out into communities that are immediately adjacent to that. And so I'm going to bring this sort of down to that Cape Sable sparrow in a moment, but I mentioned water quality, and because of the pollution caused by this agricultural runoff, the state has invested close to $3 billion, mostly in taxpayer funding, to build treatment wetlands. It's the largest treatment wetland system in the world to remove the phosphorus coming out of the lake and also off those sugar fields. So this is just an image of one of those treatment wetlands.
And Steve, I'm sorry to interrupt. For you all, it's common knowledge the role that phosphorus plays in photosynthesis and plant production of biomass, but a very small percentage of lawyers know.
So phosphorus, obviously an important component of fertilizers, usually nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, you'll see in fertilizer. Fertilizer grows plants really well. You put it on your lawn, right? But it also grows microscopic plants really well when it gets into our waterways. And so that is algae. And we know that blue-green algae is a problem in the lake, and when those discharges are made, we also know that things like red tide that's occurring right now on Florida's west coast is increasingly taking advantage of land-derived nutrients, whether running off of residential areas, agricultural areas, or even more recently a clear case made between lake discharge and sourcing phosphorus and nitrogen that helps to exacerbate red tide on the west coast. So bringing it back to Everglades National Park and the Cape Sable sparrow. This is that northeastern corner of Everglades National Park. In fact, if you could continue east a little bit further, you'd be right where we are here at FIU. This is roughly what the historic distribution of flows across Tamiami Trail were. Most of it flowing directly into Northeast Shark River Slough, that dark diagonal swath there from northeast to southwest. Very little of it going out to the west. About a third of the flows went out to the west, and that is an important area because downstream of that smaller arrow is where the Cape Sable seaside sparrow nests, and they also nest on the eastern side, but that area was a concern for quite some time because when we replumbed the Everglades, we shifted that distribution to where 90% of the water was being sent out west directly onto the nesting grounds for this species. And it's a ground nester, so you put water on the ground, it's going to cause problems during nesting season. And this just shows roughly where those different subpopulations of the sparrow exist in Everglades National Park. And really what we're trying to do with restoration by putting water back into Shark River Slough is thread that needle, getting water off those high marl prairie marshes that Mike talked about and into the slough, which is effectively a main channel of the river grass. And so getting that water through that part of the system is a goal of Everglades restoration, and it was deemed a reasonable and prudent alternative for restoration by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in consultation on these restoration projects. And this is one right here, one of the bridges of Tamiami Trail, and you can see the wet area immediately south of that bridge, indicating the benefits of this project in hydrating that marsh. And so collectively, the efforts along Tamiami Trail have allowed us to shift flows away from that western side and increasing the arrows to the east and ultimately getting that water into Shark River Slough. Of course, there we're delivering habitat benefits throughout the freshwater part of the Everglades, but bringing this back to Hughes discussion of the mangrove blue carbon earlier, we know that getting more water into Everglades National Park is essential to hydrating downstream marshes, pushing back against sea level rise, saltwater intrusion impacts, but also helping to build resilience in Florida Bay, which is a seagrass-dominated estuary. So getting freshwater flow through the park has benefits that obviously transcend what we've discussed already, because you're talking about a recreational fishing hotspot, blue carbon value of seagrass and mangroves, migratory bird species that come down for half the year, and of course a variety of other threatened and endangered species like sea turtles, West Indian manatee, and so on. I'll end there.
Thank you. Thanks for having me at this event. One thing you can always count on an economist like me to do in an interdisciplinary panel is to dial down the number of interesting slides you have to look at. So just to keep your expectations low, I'll start with this black and white one. But I do have a couple of images. My game is not nearly as strong as the last two presenters, but I have a couple figures for us to look at. So I want to talk about conserving corridors through private land, and I'm going to try to put it, perhaps foolishly, because I don't know much about it, in the context of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which I understand to be a quilt of about 18 million acres, about half of which is publicly owned and conserved, and half is private lands, much of it working land, so forest lands, ranch lands, and farms. And the assumption here is that these private lands are delivering some kind of public ecosystem services, something like flood control, water filtration, wildlife habitat, maybe scenery, and these benefits would be lost or degraded if the land is subdivided and developed. So the challenge here is, how would you conserve this corridor if it became a goal? And it's certainly not unique to Florida. There's lots of places in the country throughout the world where there's a goal of conserving wildlife corridors or corridors for other ecosystem services. One example is the elk migrations around Yellowstone National Park. In colors, different elk herds who have a regular migration pattern. They go through public land, they go through private land. These cross state borders as well. So I just want us to focus on what kind of options are available for this kind of conservation, and what are the pitfalls and advantages of some different options. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. In broad terms, these private lands could be conserved in one of three ways. One could be land use regulation. Another could be public or private acquisition, so full ownership and acquisition of the land, or voluntary agreements with landowners that could come in the form of conservation easements, which are perpetual agreements where a landowner agrees and it becomes part of the deed of the land to not subdivide and develop the land. Or you could have more short-term voluntary contracts. So in these cases, the land stays in private ownership, but there's an agreement with the government agency or nonprofit organization, like a land trust, to monitor the terms of the agreements. So as Mario mentioned, nationally, conservation easements are really the new kid on the block and the most popular kid on the block. They've quickly become the backbone of private conservation in the US, and a pretty uniquely American form of conservation. About 40 million acres are held in conservation easements across the country. That's a landmass about the size of Florida. Compared to national park area, which is about 50 million acres, easements have grown by 60% or so since 2010, so growing fast. And about 20 million, or half of this 40 million acres that are held in conservation easements nationally, are held by land trusts, so nonprofit organizations. There's about 1,200 of them across the country. There's 24 in Florida, according to my look online a couple days ago. Florida doesn't have as many acres in conservation easements as many other states, and I think that's because conservation easement donations are incentivized by income tax breaks, and Florida doesn't have an income tax, although there's still sometimes quite generous federal tax benefits. Okay, why are easements more popular than land use regulation, or why are they growing in popularity? I speculate the reason is twofold. Easements can be more effective because the regulations via easements are voluntary, and voluntary agreements can be lower cost to enforce than top-down regulations. There's an effectiveness point, and there's a fairness point. Landowners would bear the cost of ecosystem service provision under land use regulation. Under voluntary agreements, landowners are at least partially compensated, for example, through deductions if it's charitable contribution, or maybe through partial or full payments from an NGO or government agency. Easements are more popular than public full ownership or even NGO full ownership. I speculate because keeping the land in private hands keeps it more productive. That keeps state and local tax revenue flowing. And there's lower acquisition costs of acquiring, say, a conservation easement or a contract than acquiring land outright. But in the rest of my time, I want to ask, is it wise to rely on conservation easements when spatial connectivity is critical? It's not clear to me when you look at the history of the formation of conservation easements and state enabling statutes, and even the provisions in the federal code that allowed them to be tax deductible. It's not clear at all that easements were concocted for the purpose of really precise spatial connected conservation. In fact, some of the research I've done shows that land trusts, when their goal is to preserve something generic like open space, conservation easements, absent kind of tax considerations, tend to be their choice. When the goal is something targeted, where flexible and dynamic conservation is required, they tended to own land outright. Again, setting aside tax considerations. And one of the things about owning land is you can sell and rearrange property configurations based on future conditions that are hard to anticipate today. The future will have with it different development pressures, changes in the profitability of farms and forests and timberlands, and of course climate change. So my remaining comments, I want to ask what kinds of public policies might mitigate or exasperate this challenge of achieving spatial connectivity with voluntary agreements. And I want to raise just 3 areas of public policies that seem relevant to conservation easements narrowly and maybe broadly to private conservation. So 3 things. The first is transparency and oversight. So transparency and oversight for land trusts, these 1,300 or so nonprofit organizations that hold half of the conservation easements in the country. The oversight is largely voluntary. So it's up to land trusts what they report about the conservation easements they hold, which is mostly what they do is hold donated conservation easements. Government agencies do not seem to engage much in monitoring easements that they're not funding. So you have perpetual arrangements held by land trusts that may not be around in the future, and it's largely up to them thus far to report what they have and where it is. Government agencies are generally tasked with creating a database and maintaining inventory of the easements they hold. So there's some difference there. And so a question I would raise is, should land trusts have to publish annual statements that provide information about their conservation easement holdings? Should maps of conservation easements be made publicly available? So if a goal is interconnected conservation, it surely would help to know what has been conserved, what hasn't, the kind of arrangements that are conserving different pieces of land. On the other hand, the trade-off is that, easements are private property, they're voluntary arrangements, there's some privacy concerns. And so one issue in this area of thought is, what level of transparency is optimal, and it's certainly important for spatial connectivity. The second point I'll raise about spatial connectivity and public policy has to do with funding. So nationally, the biggest way in which, the most prominent way in which donors of conservation easements are compensated is through charitable contributions that they make, primarily driven by income tax breaks at the federal level, but in some cases states offer pretty generous tax credits as well. But the interesting thing about this, I think, with respect to connectivity, is that this means the strength of incentives to donate depend on idiosyncratic characteristics of the landowner's tax liability, which of course is linked to their income because higher income folks or landowners pay higher marginal tax rates. So if the ecological contribution of a landholding to the network is uncorrelated with someone's tax incentives, then it might be difficult to use tax incentives to protect important connected landscapes. And so there are some solutions that have been discussed, some of which I've written about, which are tradable tax credits, for example, revolving loans where land trusts can borrow money in the short run and pay it back later when they identify land that's available that's critical to a network. Florida's Wildlife Corridor Act does provide money for private land purchase. Some of this is divorced in Florida from the tax code. But that's a really important consideration for thinking broadly about can connectivity be achieved funding through tax incentives. The last point I'll make, and this is what I'll wrap up with, is the third public policy issue. It's very relevant to private land conservation and connectivity is the requirement in the federal tax code and in many states enabling statutes that easements be held in perpetuity. So forever, that an easement, and Nancy will add some texture to this point. But a major question is how to enable private effective conservation in the face of changing conditions, like climate change, for example. It's going to require flexibility, while conservation easements historically have been fixed. Moreover, the tax code privileges this instrument, the perpetual easement, over others like voluntary short-term contracts that are less exposed to this problem. So I'll say the benefits of perpetuity in this narrow context is you see a permanent commitment to conservation that organizations can build networks around. And so that's a benefit. A narrow cost here is it frustrates the ability to reinvest in conservation. Say you're effective in conserving one of the colored areas in Florida or one of the colored areas around the elk migration path, and you fail in some other dimension, you want to sell easements in one area and reinvest in conservation in the other where you're more successful. The deck is stacked against your ability to do that given the law favors perpetuity. The broader cost of perpetuity is, do we want our current generations to make decisions for future generations about priorities? I'll wrap up with this point, Mario, that there's a video about the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and there's a charismatic rancher in it who says, I want to conserve land because I want my grandkids to see the land like it is. And I totally understand that. But somewhere else, there's another grandpa who says, I want my grandkids to be able to afford housing. That's what I want them to do. So you have these conflicting visions of what the future could be, and perpetuity could benefit future generations or create hardships for them. There are some solutions to this, some ways of addressing it. Nancy, I think, will address some of those. And because I have negative 2 minutes, I should stop. Thank you for your attention. Sorry. I was gonna say short-term contracts could pay for presents, and I had some cool photos. See, I had some good pictures.
Well, first, thanks Mario for inviting me, and this has been a terrific conference. My focus, as you can see, is going to be on conservation easements, and there is a really wonderful video on saving the Florida wildlife corridor that Dominic mentioned. And in it, a private landowner speaks about her use of a conservation easement to protect her land in the corridor. And she says that a conservation easement is a legacy tool. As a landowner, you put restrictions on your land that will last forever. There will never be a strip mall. There will never be a housing development. You give up your development rights, she said, but it helps the landowner because the landowner receives payment for the rights they have given up. And those are the sentiments that are often expressed by landowners who have conveyed conservation easements. And by many accounts, conservation easements seem to be a major success story. As Dominic mentioned, an estimated 40 million acres are now encumbered across the nation. Hundreds of government entities and land trusts are focusing their efforts on acquiring easements. Increasing amounts of public funds are being invested in easements. But conservation easements are still relatively new, and their efficacy as long-term land protection tools remains untested. There are numerous challenges associated with our increasing reliance on conservation easements. Since I have limited time, I'm just going to focus on one that I think is most relevant to the protection of the Florida wildlife corridor, and I'll provide some suggestions as to how that challenge might be best addressed. So the challenge I want to highlight is the very real danger that perpetual conservation easements may not, in fact, be perpetual, despite the best intentions of both the landowners who convey them and the current staff and board of the organizations that acquire them. Now, I first want to note that perpetual or forever is obviously a very long time. Right? In some, hopefully somewhat rare circumstances, conditions can change on the property such that it no longer makes sense to continue to protect a particular parcel of land for conservation purposes. So this was acknowledged by the Treasury Department when it formulated regulations to govern the federal deduction that's offered for easement donations, and that deduction has been the driving force in the growth of the use of easements in the U.S. Those regulations provide that a perpetual conservation easement can be extinguished in only one way, right? In a judicial proceeding where it is shown to the satisfaction of the court that continuing to protect the subject property for conservation purposes has become impossible or impractical. And in that event, the holder has to receive a percentage of the proceeds from the subsequent sale of the land and has to use those proceeds for similar conservation purposes. So the judicial proceeding requirement is a high bar to extinguishment, but it also ensures that in the right circumstances, obsolete land use restrictions can be eliminated, and the value attributable to those restrictions can be reinvested in conservation elsewhere. So what's the problem? It seems like perpetual conservation easements are fairly well protected, and then we have an out if the land use restrictions become obsolete. Well, the problem, at least in my opinion, is how the federal law is developing, as well as clear deficiencies in the state laws that govern conservation easements following their conveyance. With regard to federal law, we have a Fourth Circuit case holding that a tax-deductible perpetual conservation easement can be extinguished only in a judicial proceeding, as I just described. We also, though, have the more recent Pine Mountain case out of the 11th Circuit, in which the court said that a tax-deductible perpetual easement is nothing more than a contract between the landowner and the holder that can be modified or terminated in the same manner as other easements, which would appear to mean by agreement of the landowner and the holder. And the 11th Circuit controls in Florida. And what about state law? Well, the Florida Conservation Easement Enabling Statute says that conservation easements are perpetual, but it doesn't contain any limits on the manner in which a conservation easement can be modified or terminated. Instead, it provides what you see there. It says a conservation easement may be released by the holder of the easement to the holder of the fee, even though the holder of the fee may not be a governmental body or charitable entity. So it would appear that in Florida, the holder of a conservation easement is free to release that easement in whole or in part to the current landowner, thereby terminating it. We also have the reality that a succession of new landowners who did not financially benefit from the placing of the conservation easement restrictions on their properties are likely to place significant pressure on holders to modify and terminate those restrictions. And for a variety of reasons, the government and nonprofit holders of conservation easements may oblige. Why? Well, holders want to maintain good relations with landowners. They want to avoid being sued. There will inevitably be changes in the personnel and priorities of the holders over time. And as development pressures increase, modification and termination of these instruments is going to become more and more lucrative for both the current landowners and the holders. So there is a very real danger that we could see conservation easements suffer the proverbial death by 1,000 cuts as they are incrementally modified and terminated. And the path of the pronghorn controversy in Wyoming provides an example of the tenuous nature of perpetual conservation easements. This path is a 5,800-year-old migration route that connects the pronghorn summer range in Grand Teton National Park with their winter range farthest south. And in 2008, this became the nation's first federally designated wildlife corridor. Its protection entailed the collaborative efforts of the federal government, state and local governments, land trusts, scientists, researchers, landowners, and many volunteers, the latter of whom removed or retrofitted dozens of miles of barbed wire fencing that acts as a death trap for the pronghorn. And millions of public funds were spent on protecting the path, including through the bargain purchase of conservation easements. Well, the conservation easement held by the Jackson Hole Land Trust, that is pictured here, it's in the center of the slide, was part of the effort to protect this path. But then a new owner purchased the encumbered land. He was a billionaire who made his fortune in coal, and he constructed the foundation for a cabin directly in the path and directly in violation of the easement. And rather than enforce the easement, the land trust agreed to amend it to allow the cabin and other development on 15 acres in the path. And they did this, or they agreed to do this in exchange for the owner's protection of 115 acres to the north that also contained a small part of the path. While the land trust argued that this would result in a net ecological gain, many, including scientists, disagreed, and the land trust was extensively criticized in the media. And I just want to point out, this was not a situation where the land to be developed had become degraded from a conservation perspective due to changed conditions. The 15 acres remained a critical part of the path of the pronghorn. At the time of this controversy, one commentator, a wildlife biologist, observed that allowing a landowner to violate the easement sets a precedent that the perpetual moratorium on subdivision and development, the cornerstone of conservation easements, is negotiable, and this opens a Pandora's box of enforcement problems for land trusts. If this kind of deal cutting continues, easements as conservation instruments will no longer be worth the paper they are printed on. And this kind of deal cutting, this is my point, not his, also would create serious inequities because wealthy landowners would be able to buy their way out of what are supposed to be perpetual restrictions, while less wealthy landowners would not have that option. Well, thankfully for the pronghorn, the intense negative media coverage eventually persuaded the landowner to abandon his plan, and he removed the foundation and restored the land. If it had not been for a tireless Wyoming investigative reporter who brought this to the attention of the public, there would be a Jackson Hole-sized cabin in the middle of the path of the pronghorn. Some of you, particularly those of you who are from the United States, may not know what Jackson Hole is, but there are only very large cabins in Jackson Hole. So this and similar controversies highlight the vulnerability of perpetual conservation easements in the absence of clear limits on their amendment and termination. So what can be done to address this challenge? Well, the best approach would be to revise the Florida and other states' enabling statutes to place clear limits on amendments or terminations. And I just want to clarify one thing that Dominic said. Right now, we only have 3 states, Maine, Rhode Island, and Colorado, that place high limits on amendment and termination. Most states in their state enabling statutes do not place any limits. Okay? And the example I have here for you is Rhode Island, which says a conservation easement may not be terminated or amended in such a manner as to materially detract from the values intended for protection without the prior approval of the court in an action in which the Attorney General has been made a party. And the statute provides that termination may be approved only if the court finds the easement is no longer serving the public interest, and an amendment that materially detracts may be approved only if the court determines, among other things, that the amendment would be consistent with the conservation purposes expressed in the easement. Now, if revising the Florida enabling statute or these statutes in other states is not possible, then conservation easements that are donated in whole or in part as charitable gifts, as most are, even if an easement is purchased, it's generally a bargain purchase, so there's a portion of it was a charitable donation. Well, the easements should include provisions placing clear limits on their amendment and termination, and also include a provision making it clear that the law governing charitable gifts applies to the easement, as that law in every state requires that donees administering charitable gifts do so in accordance with their stated terms and purposes. I'm not going to read this, but this is a sample provision that you can include in a conservation easement to try and ensure that the holder and future landowners will be bound by the limits on amendment and termination that are included in the easement deed. And I just want to end by noting that perpetual conservation easements, as Dominic indicated, are but one tool in our protection toolbox. And they should only be used if the intent is to insulate the land from the pressure of market forces for as long as continuing to protect that land's conservation values remains possible. And that is as close to forever as you can get under US law. And these are signs that land trusts give to landowners who have protected their land in their mind forever. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you. So I would like to, before taking a minute, just a couple, 2 minutes for questions, I'd like to recognize leader in South Florida and at Florida International University, trustee Mark Sarnoff, joined us. Thank you, Mark, and thank you for your amazing leadership. I have one question, just to kick things off, which is the problem of and someone please get me on the topic of rule against perpetuities over dinner later. One issue that I see is with the perpetuity problem of conservation easements. Isn't this taken care of when the conservation easement is part of a habitat conservation plan related to an incidental take permit under the Endangered Species Act? Because then the holder of the easement is, presumably the holder of the easement is held to the threat of enforcement, or presumably the holder of the easement is the one who is subject, who got the incidental take permit and is subject to Fish and Wildlife enforcement, and that would bind the landowner. How does that work when you have that top layer of Fish and Wildlife Endangered Species Act?
I don't know if Dominic knows the answer to that. I certainly don't, but we have the Endangered Species Act expert at the back of the room.
2 of them, actually. Alex, do you have a?
I don't know a ton about that, yeah. Do you?
Use of conservation easements as part of conservation plans.
Yeah, as part of habitat conservation. So typically, let's take the dune sagebrush lizard habitat conservation plan in Texas, which was an umbrella. The state legislature actually. Are you in a position to talk about that?
Not that specific.
Okay. So the idea was they made the comptroller of the state of Texas, Susan Combs. And the reason they made the comptroller the head of this incidental take permit is that it was Susan Combs, not because it was the comptroller. And she set up a system for to establish mitigation credits where you could do, if developers were gonna impact the habitat of the dune sagebrush lizard somewhere in Texas, there would be other landowners that committed to a conservation easement to preserve dune sagebrush lizard habitat on their property could enter into like a credit trading scheme, and this entire system of mitigation credits was administered by Comptroller Susan Combs at the state level, that was actually part of it. If I'm remembering correctly, it was part of a candidate conservation agreement to prevent the 4D listing, anyway, so the point is that all of those conservation easements, all of the relevant conservation easements were wrapped in this blanket of federal law and presumably had behind them the enforcement power of Fish and Wildlife Services. So it's not like you could buy a credit and then say, oh, I'm going to change, it's not like you could sell a landowner sell a credit into the system and then say, you know what, I changed my mind, I'm going to build a cavern. And so anyway, I just had a question about.
But it's like with safe harbor agreements and with the CCAs, you can back out of them. That's kind of the central point of it, right? You only have to comply as long as you feel like complying. And if you decide you aren't interested in getting the benefit of the incidental take permit anymore, you're free to back out of it. So they're much less restrictive than that kind of conservation easement where you don't have that ability. That's the whole reason they structured them the way they did, with these assurances, with the ability to back out to baseline.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that. Any other questions? We've got to move on to the next panel as quickly as possible, but yeah, please.
I'm curious about land trust that sells their easement, their conservation easement, and doesn't reinvest that in something that's conservation related, could lose their tax exemption status as a nonprofit organization.
That's an excellent question, and the answer is they should, but whether they would is highly questionable. For I would say the past 15 years, the exempt organization division at the IRS has basically done very little to supervise charities. After it got in a lot of hot water when it was allegedly not giving exempt status to conservative organizations. So now it just kind of doesn't go near enforcement of nonprofits unless there's something really egregious. So you would have to rely on the state attorney general, which is a public official at the state level, to get involved at that point. And state AGs, I would say there's maybe 5 states that have an active charities division in their state AG office. And they only get involved if it's a real egregious issue. So if a land trust basically, agreed to allow development on property and got a payment for it and decided to, instead of reinvesting it in conservation, raise the salaries of its employees or refurbish its offices, a lot of state AGs wouldn't get involved in that.
Thank you, Seth. Sorry, did you have something?
Yeah, you can go to the question.
I was going to wrap up, but
Super quick, and this is primarily for Nick, but if other folks have thoughts. When we talk about land conservation, we often talk about the choice being between voluntary incentives or governmental regulation. It seems there's something in the middle which is certainly constitutionally more well-rounded than certainly a lot of land use regulation might be at the federal level, which is compensated regulation, right? That is to say, use of eminent domain, not eliminate the voluntary part, but maintain the economic funding part. And I'm just wondering why that, I mean, even though that option's not used very much by the federal government, other than in the wetlands context. But I'm wondering, or even I guess in the wetlands context, why don't we talk about that as a middle ground option more often than we do?
So like the potential exercise of eminent domain to fill a gap in a corridor?
Yeah, and to perhaps even do it with an easement, right? To say, but to do it, but to compensate it so that you're not creating the perverse incentive problem, you're reducing litigation risk, reducing the political costs, but not making the conservation goal be put at risk by the failure to achieve cooperation or by holdout problems or whatever.
My first response would be, I agree with you that there's not much conversation around that option, at least not that I see. And then I would have to speculate about why. But one reason is you might really frighten private landowners if you pose it as a possibility.
More so than uncompensated regulation?
Maybe because it would seem like a less draconian but more likely approach, so the expected cost to landowners would be higher.
And I don't know the exact number, but virtually every conservation easement enabling statute in the states expressly provides that you can acquire land that is subject to a conservation easement and eliminate the easement, but you cannot acquire a conservation easement to protect the land by eminent domain.
So thank you. These last two panels really deserve an entire conference of their own. We have to move on, I think, to the next panel. We're running up against the clock here, but thank you all very much for this. And I have to say